In Matthew chapter 13, we read a teaching of Jesus. It's a teaching of Jesus that you're familiar with. I don't intend to throw something at you this morning that you're not familiar with, or that would be new or groundbreaking or earth-shattering, and I probably say that often because there's nothing that I could present to you that would be that. And so in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus is teaching in parables, and as we all know, when there's a teaching in parable, this is something that is like one thing, and we're making a comparison to that. And Jesus spoke in parables an awful lot, and quite frankly, and this is just my opinion, the parable of the sower is probably Jesus' most referenced parable throughout the Gospels, in part because of the importance of the message, about spreading the gospel, but then also the fact that it contains an explanation, because it's not something that we have to speculate or to guess about. So the way that I want to break down this study as far as the parable of the sower goes is pretty simply, I think we need to look first at Matthew 13, verses 3 through 8. Those verses are going to give us the context, and they're going to give the teaching that Jesus was making, but not necessarily the application. And then in verses 18 through 23, there's application. So if you break Matthew 13 down in that way to say this is the parable of the sower, I classify that as Matthew 13, 3 through 8 is the parable itself, and then Matthew 13, verse 18 through 23 is the application of the parable. So let's begin reading in Matthew 13 and verse 3. And it says, "And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow." We all understand the concept of this. This is a person that is going out spreading seed in order to grow something. The groundwork is laid here, and there's just a moment you'll see the rest of this reference. There's a person who goes out to sow seed. Verse 4, "And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up." There's going to be 4 different types of seeds here. First seed is seeds that fall by wayside and devoured by birds. There are some versions, depending on what translation you have, that use the word footpath rather than wayside. Regardless, it was a place where birds could easily devour this seed that the sower had went to the trouble of sowing. Verse 5 and verse 6, "Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away." All right. Seed number 2 falls among the rocks, springs up, grows, but once the sun rises, the thorns spring up and chokes the seed, chokes whatever fruitfulness the plant would have there. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead to the third seed. The sun comes out and withers away the seed. There's no root system in place to support the plant. And so skip ahead to verse 7, and it says, "And some fell among the thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them." Again, seed number 3 falls into the thorns. Thorns come up, choke the fruitfulness of the plant. In verse 8, "But other fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, and some 30-fold. Seed number 4 falls into good ground. This seed springs up, produces a crop." And as any of you have ever planted a garden, any of you have ever worked in farming, anything like that, you know that is the objective of planting a seed. The objective of planting a seed is to have a plant that is produced and produces fruit, produces a crop. Those first 3, not the outcome that you seek when you do that. So there's really 4 different seeds. Really, the parable itself, you could say there's 4 different seeds, but there's only 2 outcomes. Although there's really 2 different, there's 4 different things that happen: birds, thorns, sun, fruitfulness. There's really only 2 outcomes. One is either the seed was fruitful or the seed was not fruitful. There's only 2 real outcomes that are there. Either the seed and the plant were destroyed, or the seed fell into good soil and produced a crop. If you flip down to Matthew 13 and verse 18, you begin to see the application of this parable. And so verse 18 says, "Hear ye therefore the parable of the sower." Again, Jesus leaves this not up to interpretation. This is something that Jesus tells us, hey, this is what I meant when I said this. This is one of the few times where we don't have to necessarily guess or speculate or infer and use logic to figure out what does this mean. He explains exactly what he meant by each example. So let's take a look at each of these and see how we can apply these for ourselves. Verse 19, when anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, then cometh the wicked one and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. This is he which received his seed by the wayside. Remember, the first seed is the seed that the bird devoured right away, the seed that fell by the wayside, that fell into the footpath. Jesus says that when a person hears the word but does not understand it, the evil one snatches it away. Now, who is the evil one? Obviously, that was represented by a bird within the parable. It's pretty obvious that the evil one that's referenced here is Satan. Mark's account, in fact, if you read Mark's account of this same parable, it does say Satan. It says that this is referencing to Satan. Now, what does the word understanding mean? Because I think that the key word, the word that verse turns on, is understanding. The person who doesn't understand the word is where the evil one snatches it away. What does that mean? Does that mean that if we don't have understanding, that if we don't understand the things that we are taught, does that mean like what if I'm just like really stupid? Because like sometimes I can be, right? I can be really stupid. I may not understand what you tell me the first time. Like it may take 4 or 5 times for me to completely understand what you've told me. Does that mean that the evil one has come and snatched that away? What if I can't hear? What if I have some kind of hearing deficiency and I'm not able to understand what somebody is telling me? Sometimes I have people that come up to me and say, well, I think you preached a good lesson, or I think you taught a good lesson, but I didn't have a hearing aid on, and I couldn't hear you. Is that what that means necessarily? No, I don't really think that is what the word understanding means in this verse. If you read the context in Matthew 13, back up in verses 14 and 15, it says this. It says, and in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Esaias, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand. Seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. So how are we to understand? How does that happen? It happens, if you see there in verse 15, the first reference there to a part of the body is the heart. The heart is how we understand. It's not an intellectual misunderstanding. When the Bible says there that it's the person who doesn't understand, it's not referring to somebody who's just not able to comprehend that. It is referring to somebody who has a heart problem. It's more of a moral misunderstanding than an actual mental misunderstanding, an unwillingness to do what God has commanded. I think there's a very specific example of this in the Bible, a very specific example of a group of people who had that kind of misunderstanding. It wasn't that they misunderstood or that they didn't have the ability to comprehend what they were being told. It's just that they didn't want to do it. In John chapter 8, verse 25 through verse 27, we see here Jesus is speaking to a group of people mostly made up of Pharisees. And in John 8, 25 through 27, it says, then said they unto him, who art thou? And Jesus saith unto them, even the same that I said unto you from the beginning. I have many things to say and to judge of you, but he that sent me is true, and I speak to the world those things which I have heard of him. They understood not that he spake to them of the Father. We read in verse 27 there that as Jesus speaks to this group of mostly Pharisees, they say, we can't understand. We don't understand. We don't understand. We don't understand this teaching. We don't understand the things that you're speaking to us of the Father. Now understand the dialogue there in John chapter 8, it continues on for a few verses there, but if you go down to verse 42 through 45, we see a response here from Jesus. Verse 42 through 45 of John chapter 8 explains this misunderstanding. It says, Jesus said unto them, if God were your Father, ye would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Even because you cannot hear my word? You are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it. And because I tell you the truth, ye believe me not. Jesus says that the reason that they don't understand is because they don't hear the Word. The reason that because they don't want to hear the Word. Because not only do they not hear it, but it's because they don't want to hear it. Verse 46 and 47 finish the thought. It says, "Which of you convinceth me of sin? And if I say the truth, why do you not believe me? He that is of God heareth God's words. Ye therefore hear them not, because ye are not of God." So they don't hear the Word because they're not of God. Not because they weren't close enough, not because they didn't have bad hearing, and not because they didn't have the brain power to understand what He was saying, but because they were not of God. Because these people were not of God. Who were they of? They were of the devil. These people were of the devil. These were of the evil one. So once that seed is devoured by the evil one, once the seed that we talk about there in the parable of the sower, like this example here, what happens once that seed is devoured? Who do they belong to? 1 John chapter 3 and verse 8 says this. 1 John 3 and verse 8 says, "He that committeth sin is of the devil. For the devil sinneth from the beginning. For the purpose the Son of God was manifested that He might destroy the works of the devil." They're of the devil because what they've done is sinful. Because of the sin that's in their lives, those people are of the devil. So again, this is understanding when the reference there is made in the person's heart. They just flat refuse to believe the teachings of God. And what happens to that seed? What happens to the seed when somebody is given that word but flat refused the teachings of God? That seed is lost. It's devoured up by the devil, and it is lost. It's almost like if you take a kid, if you think about it, I think this is probably the best example I can think of in terms of our day-to-day lives. If you think about a kid, if you tell a kid to do something, you tell somebody to go do something, and they stick their fingers in their ears, and they say, "Oh, I don't want to hear that," and they play la 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 la. I don't hear what you're telling me. That is just refusal to hear. That is refusal to do what I'm telling Henry or whoever to do when they do that. It's very similar to that. This same example of seed going by the wayside is somewhat similar to that. I think there are some other examples of people who didn't understand the teachings of God. Again, not because they didn't have the ability, the physical limitations to hear, but just because they didn't want to, because they flat refused to obey what God had commanded them to do. I won't go into great detail about these things, but I think anytime you see an example of where there is great evil in the world or great evil in a particular situation, then that is ripe for somebody who just flat is refusing to even hear what God has to say or what a person who is speaking God's word would have to say. I think about Noah and his family and how the thoughts of man were only evil continually. How difficult would that be for the seed to be reached? If the thoughts of man are only evil continually, it would be impossible for that seed to be fruitful. There would be no soil there for it to go. Everything you said would completely be devoured up by the devil. What about Sodom and Gomorrah? People in Sodom and Gomorrah, they were taught. They had an opportunity to hear. Did any of them hear? No, they all stuck their fingers in their ears and eventually were destroyed because of it. And the final thought that I have on this idea about understanding and about seed that falls by the wayside, how do you think that turns out for the folks on Day of Judgment who had seed sowed to them, but it was immediately snatched up by the evil one? Matthew 10, verse 14 through 15 says, "And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." So again, I told you the example of Sodom and Gomorrah here. This example in Matthew 10, people who don't receive you nor hear your words, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment. That's a pretty stern warning. That's not a warning that you'd like to hear. So back to Matthew 13, verse 20 and 21, the second seed and the application by Jesus here. It says, "But he that received the seed into stony places, the same is he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it. Yet hath he not root in himself, but dureth for a while. For when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, by and by he is offended." And remember, this is seed number 2. This is the seed that's in the rocks, the seed that sprouts up, but then is scorched by the sun because it has no root. Jesus says this seed is a person who with joy receives the word, but when tribulation or when persecution arrives, he is offended and falls away. So think about that. That's a person who gladly receives the word, a person who receives it with joy, but eventually, due to external pressures, falls away. Now understand that we as Christians and we just as general day-to-day humans, we have trials and tribulations that happen in life. We have things in life that happen. Sometimes the cart gets off in the ditch, so to speak, and we have to deal with things that come along and come our way. Sometimes we're not dealt the most fair or the best hand in life, and the way that we deal with those things sometimes is what determines how our character is, what kind of character we have, and ultimately may determine how eternity shakes out for us. Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 11, I'm always comforted by these words. It says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revive you, and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake." Matthew 10:22 says, "And ye shall be hated of men for all my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved." Galatians 6, verse 9, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not." There are so many examples, so many passages throughout the Bible that talk about tribulations. Obviously, we don't go through the same things that first century Christians did, but understand they went through a lot of trials and tribulations. Those things would have been directly applicable to their lives when they heard them. They're still applicable to our lives, although maybe not as extreme as they were back then. But there are rewards for us. There are rewards. That is the thing that gets us through trials and tribulations, is the thought of those rewards. Mark chapter 14, verse 66 through verse 71, we read there, this is, I think, the best example of somebody who faced a trial or tribulation, didn't have a good root system, and that is Peter. I think Peter was scorched by the sun here in this example. In Mark 14, 66 through 71, we see it says, "And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there cometh one of the maids of the high priest, and when she saw Peter warming himself," he'd been warmed by the sun here because he's supposed to get scorched, "she looked upon him and said, And thou also wast with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, This is one of them. And he denied it again. And a little after, they that stood by said again, Peter, surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. But he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man of whom you speak." Peter's in a time of tribulation here. There is no question this is a tribulation. Jesus' crucifixion is at hand, and he has to be thinking that, if they figure out that I'm with him, they're probably going to kill me too. They probably are going to take me in with him. He's approached by people that are accusing him of being with Jesus. So how does he respond? Does he respond by saying, yes, that is my Lord, that is my Savior, that is Jesus, that is the Son of God? That is absolutely not what he does. He denies that he knows the man, denies him 3 times, and even curses to show that his speech is not the same as theirs. In fact, I find it interesting that if you read Mark's account, like what we just talked about in Mark's account, Peter actually accuses them and says, I don't understand. I don't understand what you're saying. He does the whole finger in the ear thing. Now think about someone who's on the opposite end of the spectrum. Think about people who endured tribulation, endured persecution, never faltered. Obviously Jesus is in the same example here. He endured trials, tribulations, persecutions, but was without sin. You think about Job. Job is probably a textbook story that you think about. Maybe that's an example from the Bible that you would compare that to. But what about us? What about us today? What are some things that we deal with? What are some of these external factors that we might run into, not only for ourselves, but when we teach the gospel to somebody, that would cause them, when this pressure gets on them, that would cause them to fall away, that would cause that root system to be shown and to be withered away by some kind of sun? Here are just some things that I think about, some very common things that could cause this. Peer pressure, public perception, especially as a young person. I understand that I'm not speaking necessarily to young people, but a lot of you got young people at home and in your house. It's difficult for young people, especially if you didn't grow up in church. It's difficult to go to public school and to be around, you may be in a room of 30, 40 people where you might be the only one. You might be maybe one of 3. Maybe you stand out from the crowd a little bit, and it's easy to give in to peer pressure and to public perception, to be like Peter, to say, I'm not with them. My speech is this way. I'm not with these people. It's why it's important for us to give our young people the necessary tools to build a proper foundation. What about family pressure? Family pressure is something when you teach the gospel to somebody that can cause a lot of times, when that pressure pops up, that certainly can cause a plant or a seed to not be fruitful. You study the Bible with people, maybe the seed's been sown in rocky ground because they have family that's not, maybe they're not faithful to the Lord's church. Maybe they believe something different. And maybe when that kind of pressure pops up, it's difficult for that seed to be fruitful. It's difficult for that study to be fruitful because they have a family member that believes differently. And they don't want to picture that family member being wrong in some kind of way. Certainly sometimes ideological differences with family can lead a person to jump feet first into what the Bible teaches, but only for that pressure from the family after discussing it with them to cause them to fall away. That certainly is an example of something that could happen as you study with people. In verse 22 of Matthew 13, it says, "He also that received the seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful." A seed that is characterized, the third seed here, the seed that is characterized very similarly to the one that came before it, but rather in this seed, the son is a thorn. There's something that prevents the seed from being unfruitful. In the last case, it was the son. In this case, it is a thorn. I think there is a very subtle difference between these two types of seeds. Although they sound very similar, I think there is a very subtle difference that I think if you use logic and you think about it from a realistic application of this, I think there is a very subtle difference between the two of them. The first type of seed, the seed that we talk about with the sun, what happened to you? It withered away, right? That implicates that plant or that fruit, whatever popped up from that seed, died. We're not necessarily told that about the thorn, just that it choked out, just that it was unfruitful and that the thorns choked it out. Again, the sun withers things away. Thorns more or less stunt growth and cause things to become unfruitful. Consider in your garden, if you're like me, you have tomato plants. Okay, think about your tomato plants for a minute. If you don't control morning glories, if you've ever dealt with tomato plants, you know that morning glories here in Alabama are a problem. Now, what happens to a morning glory if it goes unchecked? If you don't take a garden hoe to that morning glory the first time it pops up, what happens? The morning glory springs up and runs all the way up the tomato cage and chokes the tomato plant out. The tomato plant cannot be fruitful because of that morning glory that comes up. The thorn, those morning glories, choke out the fruitfulness of the tomato plant. Although your tomato plant looks lively, it's not alive. It's not producing fruit because it's being choked out by this thorn that's popped up. Additionally, what's that thorn doing? What is that morning glory or that thorn that's doing in the soil? It's competing. It's taking away nutrients, it's taking away water, it's taking away sun, it's taking away air, it's taking away all the things that your tomato plant needs to be fruitful. Compare that to the way that riches and things of the world can affect us as Christians. Do things of the world, do the things that pop up, riches, things that we have to deal with, and things that interest us in our lives, do those things compete with our attention as it pertains to spiritual things? Absolutely. And if we allow those things to get too big, if we allow those things to be like those thorns or those morning glories, then guess what? They choke out our fruitfulness. They choke out our fruitfulness as a Christian in absolutely the same way. We have to deal with these same kind of things. Although the parable is just an example between a seed and like a thorn here that's choking that out, that certainly can happen to us. Things in life, things that may interest us, they certainly can compete for our attention and limit our ability to be fruitful and to do the things that we need to in a spiritual sense. Matthew chapter 19, verse 16 through 22, I think there's a really good example there of somebody who was a seed that was sown that was choked out by thorns and choked out by the riches and care for the world. Matthew 19, verses 16 through 22, it says, "And behold, one came and said unto him, Good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one that is, God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. He saith unto him, Which? Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The young man saith unto him, All these things have I kept from my youth up. What lack I yet? Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Can we fall into this trap of the rich young ruler? The rich young ruler here obviously is a great example of somebody who heard the word, had practiced all the things from his youth up, but then wasn't fruitful because of these things. Can we fall into this same trap? What's more important? Worldly things, riches, or spiritual things? Where does our heart really lie? If we had to leave the worldly things, we had to leave the riches behind, could we? If you place yourself in the shoes of the rich young ruler, what would you do? It's a great example for self-examination, and I think was a very relevant example for self-examination that Jesus gave there. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 23, the last example, the last seed to talk about here. It says, But he that receives seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word and understandeth it, which also beareth fruit and bringeth forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. This is the soil that we strive to be. Good soil that is fruitful and multiplies. This is the kind of soil that we want to sow the seed to, but we don't always get to. Now, understand, I think there's a couple of things that we can touch on here. And I have a thought that at least I've had. I don't know if it's a good thought or a bad thought. It's not exactly. I have been in the hayfield a little bit this week, and I can tell you from the spring we didn't make much hay, and this fall we've made a little bit more hay. Now, there was something that happened between then. There was something that happened. Obviously, it's been dry. You all know. You're not unaware that it's been dry. It's been difficult to grow stuff. It's been difficult for people who are trying to grow things. But one of the things that we did at the house after we cut hay in the spring was we did something to our soil. We did something to the soil to try to make it a little bit more fruitful, to make our hay crop multiply, and that was we put chicken litter on our hayfield. Now, if you've ever lived out in the country, you know what that smells like, and you've probably been very thrilled when your neighbors have put chicken litter on the hayfield. Now, I think it's really an interesting thought about, there's a lesson in there somewhere that you probably could make on your own to say, what does that do to the soil? Was that a good soil? Was that a bad soil that you turned into good soil? Somehow you did it by, putting something that you could think of bad on it, but the point is this, is that sometimes soil can be bad. Soil is just not always going to be just good 100% of the time. Like the person that you run across is going to be good soil. Yes, there will be times when you run across somebody they're just good right out of the gate. They're just the right kind of person for the job. You give them the word, they take it and they run with it. They're fruitful and they multiply. There's going to be times when you come across soil that might have some thorns in it. There's going to come times when you come across some soil that's a little bit dry. There's going to come times when there's some soil that's got a footpath through it. There's going to come times when you've got soil that are in these other three categories, but what do you have to do to it to make it to where it can be fruitful and to multiply? It has to be conditioned. It has to be treated in some way. It has to be transformed from where it was at in order for it to be fruitful. And what does that take? That is on, who is the person who's responsible for that? That's on the sower, right? That's not going to be just some random person who's standing out to the side that's going to come across and put chicken litter on my hayfield for me. No, that's not the way that works. It's me. It's me. It's the person who is expecting to receive a crop. It's the person who is expecting to do that. So sometimes, and I think there's an important lesson here in this that is somewhat implied from the parable, that you can have soil that has all of these different types of variety of things that can go wrong. But sometimes it's on the sower to help condition that soil. And the way that we do that is through teaching of the Word. It's through teaching of the Word, maybe through leading through example, whatever it may be. But our goal is to get to a soil that can be fruitful and to multiply. Again, think about our command. Think about our command of, and again, compare this to the way that the parable works and the way that a sower is implied. Again, it would be great if we could go out and we could just find only the good soil. If we could only go out and plant in that rich, black dirt and not have to fool with all the, thorns and the footpaths and all that. But that's not what our command is, right? Our command is not to go out and to teach the Word or to teach the gospel to the places where it is convenient, or to teach it to the places where it is easy, or to teach the gospel to the places where we're going to be successful and we're not going to get ridiculed or anything like that. That is not what the command is. The command is for the gospel to go to all. The command is to go everywhere. That means places where it's difficult. That means places where we might be ridiculed. Places where maybe perhaps it is even dangerous. It must go to all the souls. Same way as a sower. If you were a sower, now, again, think about from a perspective of if you're just throwing out seed, maybe if it was expensive seed, you'd want to be careful about where that seed goes. But in this kind of case, what? You don't care where it goes. You just sow it and hope it comes up, right? You sow it and hope ultimately that it comes up. And so the gospel is the same way, that it must go out to all. Even if you feel like there is a chance of something being unsuccessful in your teaching, I still think the command is that the gospel must go to that place. That the gospel must go to that person, even if you feel that you will be unsuccessful in your teaching there. So that's all the thoughts that I've got for this morning. I appreciate your attention, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.